Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Page Turners Plus. I am Raul G. Williams, and today we'll be discussing Philip Nanton's Riff, the Sheikh Keen story. It is described as a biography of the Vincentian Sheikh Keen. He was a legend in his own right who played jazz music and who was also a poet. To tell you more about Philip Nanton, we have Kesua.
Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. And I will now tell you briefly a little bit more about Philip Nanton. Philip Nanton is a writer and a spoken word performer from St. Vincent and the Grenadines who currently lives in Barbados and who has performed work across the Caribbean and internationally. He's also an accomplished scholar and a previous chair of the Society for Caribbean Studies, the UK's foremost learned society for the study of the Caribbean and research promoting the Caribbean, its peoples, and its diasporas. And in that capacity, he's also edited 2 anthologies of literary criticism and 1 anthology of creative writing, and recently published a monograph called Frontiers of the Caribbean, which takes a new approach to situating the Caribbean in world literature. He's also published several collections of poetry, and the most recent book, of course, is the biography of neglected Vincentian jazz musician and poet, Sheikh Keen.
Thank you very much, Kesua. Tony, as one of our Vincentians in the group, I'd like to throw this out to you first. In the book, Philip tells the story of Riff of Sheikh's upbringing, in Saint Vincent, and how that helped in some way to shape his life in terms of music, and his sort of discipline to some extent in playing his music. Is that the common thing for the young Vincentian, particularly Vincentian boys?
Well, I guess you're asking me to put it in that era
Yeah.
of Sheikh's growing up. I'm Sheikh's junior, I need to tell you. But I know a bit about it because, I have parents who are Sheikh's age. Look, Philip, this is, I'm sorry, Roger, this is a colonial society like much of what obtains across the Caribbean. There are people trying to eke out a better life. Um, the rise of the black middle class, people trying to distinguish themselves, get a sense of identity. So there are a lot of things that are running confluently in this era, education, religion, a sense of blackness, a sense of nationhood. Um, and of course, that the colonial underpinnings of a standard that we have sort of adopted. So it's an interesting blend, and Sheikh was part of all of that. Music, funny enough, was one of the things that I feel was focused on more. I'm not talking about the formal training in music in that time than it is now. Paula may disagree with me, but I have a strong sense that there was more focus on that. And so Sheikh grew up with an exceptional father in that sense, who gave him the knowledge of or the tools to pursue music, but also an academic education. And that was very typical with the upwardly mobile black family in that era. So I don't know if I've captured that for you, but maybe Paula might want to add a bit.
And as Paula sort of comes in here, I also got the impression that he didn't necessarily come from a very rich or even middle class family. So I think his accomplishments were quite spectacular. Paula?
Yeah, he would be, by the standard of the time, he would have been lower middle class. His father was a policeman. And I don't disagree with you, Tony. I believe that was typical. The emphasis on formal education, music training, that was typical of the lower middle class, or all of the middle classes, in fact, because those were avenues for upward mobility. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say on that.
Sort of a very typically colonial education in a sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think additionally, you had around that time, and Philip in his book identifies that very early. He talks about the three currents. He talks about the current of nationhood. I think that's how he or nationality, um, migration, and well, Sheikh's masculinity. But the first two um, were definite features of that era. Migration was a big thing. Migration to the UK was, well, we all know about Windrush, was a big thing. And that was not just Sheikh's experience. That was very typical of any um, lower middle class to up to middle class family trying to eke out a better life for their children and to sort of, remain upwardly mobile.
And it's that point there is one feature of the book that I felt could have been done a lot better in terms of contextualizing Sheikh's experience with others. And there's no lack of recent work on the Windrush generation. I was waiting for that. I felt that it would have caused me to understand Sheikh much better, to get a better picture, a fuller picture of the context, and especially of musicians and artists who were a part of the Windrush generation.
Mhm. I did intend to ask the two historians in the group about that, because I thought that was something that I thought could have been filled in more, the historical context. But then, I mean, Philip is not a historian. His area is literature, and you will notice that when he deals with the literature, especially in chapter 6, he does it brilliantly. I loved chapter 6. Chapter 3 and chapter 6 were my favorite chapters. In chapter 3, he deals with the progression of Sheikh's musical career when he gets to England. And then in chapter 6, he does an overview of Sheikh's his poems, all of his poems. But I did feel that I would have liked to see more of the historical context in which Sheikh lived.
But then, before we get the historians, I'm sort of wondering if maybe it's just Philip's sort of profession, being a poet. He sort of expects us to fill in the gaps because the story itself, when you read the book, you immediately start to think Windrush generation. So I think he might have maybe deliberately or not so done it so that we could just fill in the gaps. The historians,
I think probably is not interested in the historical context as say I would be.
I'm not sure if I agree with that. I think my reading actually is that he tackles it, but I got the sense that he's writing to a readership who's very familiar with this story. The idea of the Windrush is not something that his readers are going to be unfamiliar with, and so he doesn't delve into it. What he does do is make a few statements setting the scene, I thought, and it really is a couple of sentences and words that, this is a time where, prejudice was rife, that it's very difficult in particular ways. He makes it very clear that this is the Windrush setting, and Sheikh has quite a different experience from a lot of other people. I agree with you, Eric, in terms of I would love to hear more about the other musicians and artists of the time. He mentions Johnny Dankworth, and this is a big band orchestra that I'm familiar with, I think vaguely, and I hope I'm not getting the people wrong. And they featured in films of the time. So they were really big, and so that gave me context because I know those films from that period. About Black life in London and the faith challenges of people at that time. That name jumped out at me. So I'm in two minds. I think on the one hand, I think he did it quite well, but at the same time, you got a real sense of what I did. And I presume that's the audience is Caribbean people who know that story would also. Yeah, but at the same time, I can understand, if you were completely new, perhaps you'd be lacking real context there.
And I think, if I may, Roger, I think what Philip does really well throughout the book, as Keswa mentions the London or England experience. The capturing of that jazz club mood um, throughout the book, which is basically Sheikh's life in these what I call CD clubs. I'm sorry, Kessler, but you know, I get the. I've been to a couple myself, so let me confess, right? I'm no stranger to Ronnie Scott's, let me tell you, right? But and Ronnie Scott's is upscale, but
Right.
there are these,
Not
but there are
CD.
these that's not seedy, but there are these holes that smoke filled and conversations 3 o'clock in the morning. What are you doing up 3 o'clock in the morning? You're probably not up to anything good, but that is the that is the mood that Phillips captures, and really it's a reflection of Sheikh's life. How he spent his hours when he wasn't writing, I suppose. That was his outlet. When he wasn't writing or performing, that was his entertainment, and a lot of that takes place in England and London, the Soho area, as you know, Kessel, that is famous for that even today. So I think Philip captured that very well.
Well, what I found interesting about the whole London experience is that Sheikh wasn't writing much during that time. He was concentrating on his music. That took up most of his time. So yeah, I just thought I'd mention that.
And go ahead,
Yeah,
Eric. Sorry.
Yeah, definitely. My surmise is that he wasn't writing much was because the brother and Coleridge Good, those brothers were on the cutting edge of jazz at that point. I mean, his focus was on innovation, and that takes a lot of energy, and that in and of itself, for me, made that section of the story, that section of Sheikh's life, so compelling. Because be honest, I never heard of the brother, and I'll say this right now: I'm glad we chose this. It really enriched my knowledge of jazz in that era, especially in the UK, by Black artists, Afro-Caribbean artists. But yeah, I think I was mildly surprised that he was on the cutting edge of a type of jazz coupled with poetry that I knew about as a kid growing up in the 1970s in New Orleans. I mean, to me, when I was reading that section, I was thinking about Gil Scott-Heron, and the coupling of spoken word and the Congo drum, and little flute riffs and sax riff and everything. So, man, I was excited reading that. So yeah, I think his writing fell back, at least things that we have recovered, because he was working hard at his craft.
Mm-hmm. And Gil's sorry, go ahead, Francine.
Absolutely. And remember when he started doing the poetry with jazz sessions, there was a whole discussion about the fact that, and it's something that struck me as I was reading, and then Philip Nanton addressed it, that he was doing these sessions that coupled poetry with jazz, but he was not only was he not reading any of his own poetry, none of them even knew that he wrote, right? And he discussed that for quite a few pages, that in fact, and when asked about it later, he said, "Oh yeah, nobody knew that I wrote poetry, and that's not why he was involved in the project." Because when that first came up in the book, I immediately thought, "Oh, okay, he's going to be reading his poetry and as well," and he absolutely wasn't. So I think really the music was what his focus was on. He also did not complete his degree in literature. So really, he really decided that the music was where his focus was going to be while he was in London.
Mm-hmm. But some of that too may have simply been driven by economics. He was trying to support his family.
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
I've never known of a well-known poet, of a well-paid poet. So I've heard of a few well-paid musicians, but I've never heard of a well-paid poet. So it may have just been that was a practical thing to do.
Now, Paula, you about to say something about Gil Scott Heron? He's one of my favorite artists of all time. I want to hear something.
I'm just mentioning that Gil Scott Heron is very well respected in jazz circles in the UK. I don't know if Kessawa is a jazz fan, but I am a big jazz fan, and I listen to a radio station. My favorite radio station is actually a UK a jazz radio station, and they play a lot of Gil Scott Heron. Yeah.
But as you mentioned that you've never heard of a well-paid poet, I also get the impression that Sheikh wasn't well paid as a musician either. And in later parts of the book, you realize that he did not make much money from his career, or if he did, he spent it all. Unfortunately. But also in terms of like the structure of the book, I think maybe Philip is sort of bringing us into the new age of biographies, because he gives us all these references all these multimedia references that we're meant to click on. And you get, for example, the link to Sheikh walking down Archer Street with Linton Kwesi Johnson. And Sheikh is describing his experience of coming to London and going to the job exchange and how he suddenly became this musician in London. So I think Philip is trying to tell us, I'm not going to give you all, but you go and do some research for yourself.
Yeah,
I think some of that. Oh, sorry. I was going to say, I think some of that is because he's a scholar. He's trained as a scholar, though, right? Some of that is just his natural way of saying, this is how we work. Here's the basics. But if you want to know more, here's where you go.
But I also I thought I've never seen a formal work done in the way that Philip did this work. Some of his sources are bloggers. I loved the combination of formal sources and informal sources. I don't know if it's innovative, but I've never seen it before. So I was kind of excited about that.
I think it's about expertise. Like some people who know the jazz scene best are not scholars. They're musicians who have a blog. One of the blogs, I swear, is an old music teacher I used to know. I was like, I know that name. Is he famous like that? And he was very serious about his music. I didn't know he was like famous, like someone's going to quote me in a book in years to come. Sorry, that was an unnecessary plug, but I was amazed.
We've spoken a lot about Sheikh the poet and how he wasn't a well-paid poet, but it might be a good time to go and listen to a performance by Sheikh from his Volcano Suite.
The thing split Good Friday in two, and that good new morning groaned and snapped like breaking an old habit. Within minutes, people who had always been leaving nowhere began arriving nowhere. Entire lives stuffed in pillowcases, used plastic bags. Naked children suddenly transformed into citizens. Ologists with their guilty little instruments were already oozing about the mountainsides bravely, and by radio. As a prelude to resurrection and brotherly love, you can't beat ructions and eruptions. Flies ran away from the scene of the crime and crouched like Pilate in the secret places of my house, washing their hands. 30 grains of sulfur panicked off the phone when it rang. Mysterious people ordered other mysterious people to go to mysterious places immediately. Oh, I wondered about the old woman who had walked back to hell to wash her Sunday clothes. All the gray long day, music, credible and incredibly beautiful, came over the radio, while the mountain refreshed itself. A man who lives inside a microphone kept things in order. 3 children in unspectacular rags, a single bowl of gray dust between them, tried to manure the future round a young plum tree. The island put a white mask over its face, coughed, cool as history, and fell in love with itself. A bus, traveling heavy, cramped as Calvary, thrust its panic into the side of a hill. And then the evening's blanket, sent like some strange gift from abroad, was rent by lightning. After a dream of rancid hope and Guyana rice, I awoke to hear that the nation had given itself $200,000. The leaves of my plum tree did not glisten when wet. An old friend phoned from Ireland to ask about the future. My Empire cigarettes have lately been tasting of sulfur. I told her that.
All right, welcome back. And before we took the reading from or the performance by Sheikh, we were discussing, Sheikh's life in London and how he sort of used London as his jump off for music and to some extent poetry. But I think that another thing that we do have to address, especially for the Vincentian audience, is and the Caribbean audience as well, is how Sheikh was treated as an adult in his own Saint Vincent. And in the book, we learned that he his good friend, the former Premier and Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, who passed away a couple months ago, Sir James Mitchell, offered him a role as Director of Culture. And after the wranglings and of government, and he lost government, we learned that Sheikh was fired essentially. Anyone wants to comment on that? Even though he was a brilliant musician, and he had so much to offer.
Okay, go ahead. I'll come after you, Eric.
Okay, I'm raising a question, and this is something that I fail to get a good sense of. Is I understand the necessity of having a Department of Culture, but I didn't find in the text an explanation why Son Mitchell at this point wanted a Department of Culture. I wish that would have been spelled out. I mean, what were the reasons behind this, and why did he choose Sheikh Keen for this? The brother had been gone for a while. I mean,
that's a good question,
yeah.
Eric. But I'd like to hazard a guess and say, this was we're heading into independence and we're trying to forge our own identity. That's my guess. I don't know.
I think
it's a good guess.
Yeah, I want to take the question of why Sheikh King, because I think you're right. Like, given that he'd been away for such a long time, it's a really high-profile position for a ministry that's going to be under a lot of scrutiny. And I think in some respects, from what we know from the biography, Sheikh was perfect for it in the sense that he was a brilliant musician. He understood how the arts work, but he also had the background and the scholarly and the intellect of a teacher and the discipline to kind of run what we think will be, he'd been a principal, so he knows how to run a big organization, theoretically. We don't know if he was actually a good principal, but we assume so, right? So on the one hand, it seems like a logical choice for him. Like it doesn't feel nepotistic, and Philip doesn't suggest. Philip is not my brethren. Mr. Nanton, the author, doesn't suggest that it's a nepotistic choice. But it is. I don't know. Given that the book kind of touches on his own alcoholism, I don't know that he'd have the right temperament for the pressure of that kind of particular role. I think he'd have the capacity, competency, but I don't know if. And I'd be really interested to hear those of you who know the story better for living in St. Vincent, how you read it. But I think that was a really interesting question, Eric. So I
think we should invite Tony, because Tony actually knew Sheikh. Do you think that his alcoholism, because I know a lot of high functioning alcoholics, they have perfectly normal professional lives. Their private lives are messy, but I have known.
I'd just like to say, I feel like you should have told us you knew him before we started talking about your friend.
Tony, you want to comment?
So it's a small country with a population of 100,000. So somebody with Sheikh's profile is difficult not to know him. I think I agree with Paula that they're alcoholics that function in high capacities. I think alcoholism is a problem in the Caribbean. I honestly think so. Those who admit they're alcoholics and those who are alcoholics and don't admit it. It speaks to productivity. It speaks to a lot of reasons why we are perhaps not as disciplined as we should be. Nobody seems to want to pick up that and discuss it, the function of alcohol as it relates to the way we function as a people. Just out of interest, one of our main products here is an overproof rum, and we're very proud of it. But that is controversial for me, because that same product that we're very proud of, I think, has done a lot of damage to the society. A lot of spousal abuse. It's I'm not saying that the alcohol causes it, but certainly the alcohol makes it come to the surface. But anyway, let's not go there. Sheikh, let me put some context. I was in the UK, behind God's back, in a place called Porthcurno, and I was at a college there, Kessel, Cable and Wireless at this college there, and I was listening to my Sony those flat radios that had the shortwave bands, and I was listening to a BBC program, and I caught it like 5 minutes in, and then I realized that the program was about Sheikh. It was a feature on Sheikh, and I thought, here I am in the UK, 4,000 miles away from St. Vincent, listening to a program featuring somebody from where I am from. And when I casted myself back to the local scene, I sort of transposed myself back there, didn't have the sort of reverence for Sheikh as this program was, exposing. And that, Roger, is the point that Philip is trying to make. Hero is never honored in his own land, sort of thing. Sheikh was not as revered in his hometown as he was in the UK and Europe, for that matter. When he toured Europe, when he played with, was it the German Philharmonic Orchestra? Yeah. I think those were Sheikh's high points, frankly. I think that's, after that, he came back, and we can argue whether the position of director of culture was warranted. Was it nepotism? Was it just being created to to give Sheikh a job. I don't. I mean, Paula may get more into that. I can understand the reason for a focus on culture, mind you. But the point is, the degeneration really started when she came back after those some 20 something years, and the book got very sad after that. You have to say, you know, you were witnessing a giant in many respects, because in physical stature, the man is a giant, you know, and in his music and his poetry, he's also a giant. But you are witnessing through Philip's work, you're witnessing the demise, and he does come to a sad end, you know. Literally becomes, in my mind, Paula, a vagrant in New York.
Yeah,
you
I
know?
found that
And that's sad to witness.
yeah. I found it very, very difficult to read that part of the biography, where he is living in a hovel in Bed-Stuy. This is this brilliant man reduced to nothing, with obviously untreated, you know, mental illnesses. I mean, suffering from depression, which as Caribbean people, we don't discuss mental illnesses. In fact, we wouldn't even call it a mental illness, but he's suffering from depression, from alcoholism. And this is somebody, and we don't even, we just didn't get the benefit of him, I think, as Caribbean people during his lifetime. I know that Raul J had some questions about that. And I have a question for the non-Vincentians, the four of you who are not Vincentian. Had you ever heard of Sheikh Keen before you read this biography?
Absolutely not.
No.
In fact, I was
Absolutely
like,
not.
oh, who's this person whose biography we have to read? Oh,
Right.
what did he ever do?
I mean, definitely, and I'm glad, and that is, as I kept reading it, I'm like, but how is it possible that I don't know who this person is? Because the first part of the book, it's pretty much the who's who of Caribbean literary men of letters, of whom he was a part. I recognized all of the others, but I had never heard of Sheikh Keen, and I'm like, how is it possible that I don't know who this person is when I know everybody else that were his contemporaries? That not just were his contemporaries, he actually knew them and worked with them.
And they respected his work tremendously.
And they respected his work. And yet somehow, you know, he's not known outside of St. Vincent.
I can answer that question a little bit as to why you've never heard of him. And the short answer is there are so many people in Caribbean history. There are so many stories that remain yet to be told. And for me, this is a perfect example. You know, it's like, it's not, we don't lack heroes, events, contributions. We lack historians.
Yeah.
It really is that simple. And I'll leave it there because I really think that's the answer.
Yeah,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, there's just this irony that I've known for years. You know, I love music. I don't listen to jazz as much as I used to. Maybe about once a week, I listen to jazz continuously. But I remember as a kid listening to the Average White Band. And the sound of the Average White Band. I mean, the name itself was an irony. You know, this is these 5 white dudes and one black dude on the drums. But Hamish Stewart, you know, that falsetto, and that's straight out of Motown. You know, and even before with the Rolling Stones, that style is borrowed from black music. So I've sensed this irony within the UK of elevating black musical artists, and some black artists who move to the UK and become very famous in the UK, but lack that fame back where they're from, whether from the Caribbean or from the States. And it's this irony because of the racism in the UK,
Yeah.
the colonial legacy
Mhm.
of the UK. I don't know. Maybe in one sense, Shake's lack of renown in St. Vincent's or even in the United States is partly due to that UK connection and what British folk do to black artists. I'm not talking about in a negative sense, but in terms of bringing them in, embracing them, and then others on the outside, like some of us, will say, "Hey, what's going on here? Why he cozying up to these white folks?" I don't know. That's just my weird way of thinking about things.
I think there's also an element of we don't value the things that Sheikh brought to the table. How much do we name? How many celebrated poets are there in the Caribbean? I mean, outside of nerds like us, because we are nerds, and that's why we know about them. How much of the general population knows who Caribbean poets are? The general population know about popular musicians.
And then also the genre of music that he did as well in the Caribbean would not have been
jazz
popular.
in my parents' age group was the popular music.
Ah,
My father and my uncles were jazzmen, which is why I'm a jazz fan myself.
And Royal J. Sorry, Paula. You
No,
finish.
go ahead, Tony.
No, I wanted to jump in at that point. Something I was trying to establish early up. I think it was your first question about formal music training. And formal music training is a leverage to playing across the genres, and it is something I feel that we become almost single focus here in the Caribbean with genre. Um, I'm not bashing soca, please. But I'm just saying that just seems
That
to be,
reassures me.
yeah, that just seems to be the single focus. Whereas in Shake's era, in Paula's parents' era, and her and mine, um, we looked across a lot of music genres, and so you see that Shake played a lot of soca. Shake played on a lot of soca artists. He played with Frankie McIntosh in the latter years in the studio. And a lot of our top soca artists. So the man was versatile. The
Mhm.
man was a complete musician. Let's just get that right. He was a complete musician. But Paula, your point is well taken. How many people in the Caribbean value the work of people like Sheikh? And that probably speaks to the reason why a lot of these people are not known.
Mhm.
And guess what? I take your point as well. Historians need to bring them to the fore, capture them, and put it out there. So yes.
Yeah, and I'm wondering how that also played into the him not really being accepted in the director of culture post. And one of the things that I wish that Philip Nanton had done, developed a bit more, is like we knew that he had this position. He had it for 2 years and then he was fired because of a new party. But I didn't get a sense of what he accomplished in those 2 years. Like, did he do a good job of being the director of culture? Like, he had lots of wonderful ideas, the ideas that he spoke about when he accepted the post. He had great ideas, which at that time would have been fantastic. But did he actually accomplish anything in those
I
2 years? Do we know? Do we know?
I agree with you there, Francine. And I felt, especially the time that this book was published, it was published very early in 2021. So I'm thinking that this book would have been a work in progress for maybe a year and a half before that. I wanted Philip to maybe press more of Sir James Mitchell, for example, maybe do like a full on interview and get more information out of him. And, unfortunately, no, we won't get any more information out of him. So I think maybe Philip has notes hanging around somewhere that he just didn't publish. But I really wanted to hear more from the people of the time.
Well,
Let's get this point in. Let's get this point in though. there is a part which Philip mentions in the book where a minister of government in the government that fired or disbanded the post of director of culture. There's this famous statement: "You can't eat culture," and this is coming from a minister. Okay, I really don't want this discussion to go further without getting that in,
Yeah.
and that tells you the sentiment and the respect. And Paul was making that point that we have the collective we for works of people in that field. It's an inconvenience to be entertaining it. Let's get on with bread and butter issues. Culture is not that. You know,
And
that's what
let me
And
put
I
can't eat culture
feel,
is.
my
I
2 cents in
feel
about that.
like,
Sorry.
I
I
have 2
feel
cents
like
as well.
we still have that attitude towards culture in the Caribbean, that no one, people who are trying to actually make a living from the things that they love, music, art, theater, it's practically impossible in the Caribbean because, and which came first, the chicken or the egg? Is it hard to make a living in it because of the fact that people have always said you can't eat culture, and therefore nothing has been put in place to ensure that people actually can eat culture in the sense that they can actually make a living and so feed themselves from culture. I feel like we still have, even though most of the islands now have ministries of culture and cultural programs, but when you look at artists actually trying to make a living from it, we still have a really long way to go.
Mm,
Isn't that something that me and Motley tried to address relatively recently when she talked about thinking differently about the economy in the Caribbean and building a sort of creative economy?
mm.
Am I misthinking things?
No,
I'm
you're
thinking
right.
very
You're
recently.
right. There's some concerted effort now to look at the creative and performing arts, and especially with the advent of this technology that we're using. Getting your work out there on platforms that reside in the cloud. So access to markets, as it were, made easier through this sort of technology. Yeah, there is some concerted effort, I think it's fair to say, across the Caribbean, and Mia Motley has zeroed in on it. So it's a paradigm shift
Mm.
that we're really experiencing.
Yeah, that statement hit me hard because I look at the Caribbean as a region, as a place that is deeply rich with culture that one could eat if a focus was on that. And being from New Orleans, hey, look, we black folk from New Orleans, most of us grew up lower middle class, working class, low income. But the arts was just something that was just ingrained in us. Informal, informal training, street training. I mean, we grew up singing what we call street songs. I don't know where they were. I've never seen a sheet of the music, but we grew up. You little boy, you singing, "Hey Pocky Way," that kind of song. Or we would just beat on anything we could find, and we just drive our teachers crazy. And then there's the New Orleans School of Performing Arts as well. I was in the arts in high school. I did drama. I acted. And so and I wasn't put down in my high school because I did that instead of running track, which I started off doing, being an athlete. There was none of that. Partially the type of high school I went to, but you can eat culture. New Orleans, New Orleans eats culture and tourism every day. you know, so it can be done. Um, and I understand the bread and butter issues, but it's not an either or, it's a both and. So I think that's a good point that we're bringing up, is that it seems like Sheikh Keen got caught up in that crossfire.
Yeah.
definitely the political wranglings, but definitely a crossfire of political interest in the mid 70s.
And this is probably a good time to cut into a bit of a reading on what I would call Shakespeare's demise. I call it Shakespeare's demise, and so we'll have a reading by Philip Nanton himself from the very last chapter of his book.
Hello, everyone. Philip Nanton here. I'm going to read now from my recent book, Riff, the Sheikh Keane Story, and I'm reading the passage from the very end of the book, and it goes like this. Sheikh led a rich and varied artistic life with high levels of accomplishment in both literature and music. But in his story, the relationship between art and life is a complicated one. He was acclaimed in the international world of jazz as well as Caribbean poetry circles, and, however briefly, reached the upper echelons of his island's official world. By contrast, he had also experienced a troubled reception back in St. Vincent and the difficulties of a second diasporic experience, in a way, a sort of self-imposed exile in New York. He was undoubtedly more at home in the informal world of music and performance than the formal world of government. But despite setbacks in both, he endured and made his mark, carving out a life of relative artistic freedom in his own terms. What this phrase signifies is a commitment to collaboration in the making of music of all kinds, from simple to complex, a commitment to his own way of living his life, whatever the cost. And third, a commitment to challenging the conventional boundary between playing jazz and writing poetry. As a Caribbean migrant musician in post-war London, he is also part of a history that demands to be remembered and is slowly being uncovered. For example, in his autobiography, Michael Garrick is unstinting in his praise of both Joe Harriott and Sheikh Keane. He observed, "Joe and Sheikh scaled the heights in the beauty and originality of their playing, while making their personal decline all the more, which made their personal decline all the more tragic. I see them as the nearest equivalent to Diz and Bird that the UK ever produced." After Sheikh died, newspaper obituaries in London, New York, and St. Vincent extolled his achievements. As the Times put it, the most brilliant trumpeter and flugelhorn player of his generation of London-based West Indian musicians, he was also a prize-winning poet and educator. One Vincentian newspaper claimed that he was a great Vincentian, perhaps better known internationally than in the country in which he was born. Soon after his death, a sparsely attended memorial service was held for him in the Kingstown Methodist Church. A few years passed. The political regime that had dismissed him from his post as Director of Culture was once again in power. But Sheikh's stature as an international artist was undeniable. The world had praised his musicianship, and his home country could not deny the accolades. Pressure mounted for an official response. A bust of Sheikh Keane was commissioned, and in a few years, a dark, polished wooden bust with spectacles was duly completed. The unveiling was an official affair at which I was invited to speak. It was held in Kingstown's Art Center, the Peace Memorial Hall. I expected a substantial audience, but it was held during the day, which limited the numbers. Time had passed and musical tastes had changed. There was a small table in a plain room from which a minister of government and a few others, including myself, looked out onto a sparse audience. When it was my turn to speak, I suggested that Sheikh's achievements were heroic. Afterwards, the minister took me aside and pointed out that Sheikh was not an official national hero. That accolade requires formal government cabinet approval. There is one officially recognized national hero in St. Vincent, Chief Joseph Chatoyer, the French-speaking Carib who resisted the British in the 18th century. Sheikh clearly did not match up. Had he been present, I could imagine a wry smile. With typical irony, he once observed to his friend Eric B., "When you're dead, you're famous."
Welcome back. And Kesua, just before we took the break, it looked like you wanted to jump in on something. So
I think it's thinking about the question of New York. Why did he go? He'd had such a great time in Europe. Why didn't he say, okay, St. Vincent's not working, I'm going to go back to Europe? Why did he choose to go to New York, where it seemed like he lived as an illegal immigrant at a really difficult time, or an undocumented migrant rather than an illegal immigrant? But also, when it wasn't working out, why didn't he leave? And also, why did he decide it was St. Vincent or Europe or America? Why not go, okay, St. Vincent's not cool. Let me try St. Lucia. What's going on in Grenada? Back Trinidad. I was really curious about that. Like, why?
Yeah, so it may seem strange to you, you know, but St. Lucia's 21 miles north of us, Grenada is 60 something miles south of us, and I'm just giving you the geography, right? But that's just about it, physical distance. It's probably more of a connection in that era, in that time, and maybe even now, with being in London or being in New York, which Sheikh would have felt. But he would have been an absolute foreigner, alien in Grenada and St. Lucia or Barbados.
But what is different, Kessawa, in the conditions between St. Vincent and Grenada or St. Lucia? Wouldn't he have gone and met the same mindset, the same political tribalism, the same lack of scope? Because I know that we probably think Sheikh would have made a more of an impact here if he had stayed. But would he really? Because if he didn't have the opportunities for growth here that he had in England, he certainly wouldn't have discovered the flugelhorn. One of his responses to was moving to England worthwhile? Was, well, yes, that is where I discovered the flugelhorn. So I don't know. And first, we also don't have a culture of moving from migrating from island to island in search of opportunity. There was a little bit of that moving to Trinidad from Grenada and from St. Vincent, moving to Trinidad during the oil boom.
Trinidad, Curacao,
Yeah,
Aruba.
right.
And that was driven by oil,
That was
essentially.
But generally, we move to the metropolis. That is what we do as Caribbean people.
Yeah, when Nanton introduced that early on, there's in terms of African diasporic theory, the late Dr. Ruth Sims Hamilton, one of my, she was at Michigan State when I was there. She came up with a term called circulatoriness to describe movement. So this goes all the way back to the transatlantic slave trade, but also talks about 19th century movement right after emancipation or abolition. People moving from Barbados, saying to Cuba, or Jamaica, going to Belize or to Panama for work opportunities, and then to the larger metropolises during the 20th century. So he fits within that, especially Paula's last point about going to those larger cities, London, New York. We can include Toronto in that as well. Later on, Miami. So that seems that was the emphasis during Sheikh Keen's life. But again, I think, and this is the point that Nanton makes early in the text. He's an artist, and it's almost this wanderlust that artists have, and he's flowing in that, but also following an established pattern of migration of other Caribbean folk during the same time period. So it doesn't surprise me that he wound up in New York. Plus, Nanton mentioned that his sister lived in New York too. Mm-hmm. So why not go where you got a relative, hang out with sis?
Yeah. Listening to you guys talk about this part of the book, which deals with migration, just this minute dawned on me why I like that poem by Sheikh Credential. I like it, but the reasons come very clear because in that poem, it really addresses his migratory passage, moving with his credential, and the fact that that is what identified him. He took it out, blow it, and they like it. All of the people who liked it were everybody else except home. So what he did, he just told them to fee off. I love that poem, Paula. But it really addresses that migratory passage of Sheikh's life.
And to be slightly controversial, I'm wondering if Sheikh worked out St. Vincent is not the place for him. Like he just figured, regardless of my condition, like because even when he was, on his way out of life with suffering from stomach cancer, he left St. Vincent. I think he just worked out, St. Vincent isn't the place for me.
I think he was just so bitterly disappointed because this man is a nationalist and he comes back home because he thinks he can make this contribution to this society and he is rejected. That had to have been hard to take.
And we don't have, Paul, you've unmuted yourself.
Oh, no, I was making way for you, Kesawa.
Oh. No, I was going to say, and that's a part of the migration story that we don't like to tell. How many people go home? I'm very much a child of Windrush, and how many of my grandparents' generation planned to leave, planned to build a place at home, and when they got home, found that home was not as much home as they thought. That they didn't fit in anymore. It had changed.
And they had changed.
They have changed as well.
I
think it's a part of the story that we don't like to tell because it's quite difficult. It's hurtful to have somewhere. I think Carol Phillips, I know everyone hates him, but Carol Phillips as the Caribbean serving as this kind of psychic respite for a lot of Caribbean people in the UK, to the Caribbean's detriment in some respects because they don't see it as a real place. They see it as a place like in the same way that our ancestors saw Africa in some respects, right? It was a place that your soul would go to when you died. And for a lot of people who are diasporic Caribbean people or Caribbean people who've been away for a very long time, the Caribbean remains a space that they hope for, that they wish for, but they almost don't see it in its own right, I would say.
And I will jump in there because that whole part really spoke to me as I think, I'm probably the only one of us who's an actual immigrant living somewhere else. And that whole, from the beginning when Philip Nanton talked about migration as one of the currents of Sheikh's life. And then of course the book went on to explain exactly what that meant. That really spoke to me as someone who has lived outside of the Caribbean for 20 years and does dream one day of going back, but wondering, what is it going to be like, because, when I go back now, I'm there as a tourist. What will it be like to live there again? I really, really would love to, but, how will I be accepted? I mean, even, I hesitate to even weigh in sometimes on discussions on social media about things happening back home because, people are like, well, she don't even live there anymore. So one, she doesn't know what's going on. And two, why does she even care? But we do care actually, because it's home. It's just, it's home and we care.
No, I get that. And that's part of the story that had me thinking a lot. Even though technically I'm not an immigrant, I feel like an immigrant because of living where I live in the United States, which is nothing like the community I grew up in. And I go home regularly. I go home twice, maybe sometimes 3 times a year, and I love it. But yes, you grow. When you go somewhere that's so different from where you grew up, you grow. You see things differently. Your worldview is challenged. Your scope is widened. You become more cosmopolitan. I mean, that was one of the reasons why I wanted to leave New Orleans, because I was like, I'm getting away from these ignorant people. And they're ignorant. That's how I felt as a young man. And then when I came back, I was like, the stuff I'm reading in graduate school about culture and history. I said, wow, Louisiana is more than what we think it is. And so I get that. And now I want to go back home. And I don't think I will go back home and not leave again. I will stay or maybe split my time, but not split my time here. It's too cold. But that's the heartbreaking part of the story for me. It's not simply that people back in St. Vincent didn't appreciate Sheikh King's artistry. It was that people in St. Vincent didn't appreciate Sheikh King as a person.
Yeah.
Well, as you bring that up, Eric, I know Roger and the rest of us page turners wanted to question that national hero concept or that status for Sheikh Keen. Does he have the characteristic traits of someone who can be a national hero? I mean, he is a hero, as flawed a genius as he is. But when you think about national hero, you think about something else. So it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts.
And we can't forget the bad characteristics that he had that came out in the book as well. So I think Paul is going to jump right in here.
Yeah, because you see, I have, and I don't care if everybody vexed with me. I like my heroes flawed. I have no problems whatsoever with the fact that Marcus Garvey had talks with the KKK. Zero problems with that. I am one of these people advocating for Bob Marley to be a national hero. I feel if Bob cannot be a national hero of Jamaica, we should have no heroes. If a man like Alexander Bustamante can be a national hero, I don't see why Bob can't be. All of us have feet of clay. Heroes are ordinary people who do extraordinary things. I don't see why our heroes have to be Jesus. Sheikh was not Jesus, but Sheikh was extraordinarily talented. He did extraordinary things. I think he is a perfect candidate to be called a national hero. That is my 2 cents on that.
Well, Paula, I'm not gonna lie. Before this conversation, I was very reluctant to give this man any kind of credit beyond excellent musician. But you've convinced me. I'm like, okay, if that's the rationale, we put a little statue up and we're like, wife beater probably on the statue too, terrible father.
But women. But you're a historian and you study Caribbean history. Alexander Bustamante. If Alexander Bustamante can be a hero, why can't Bob be?
I'm not a Jamaican. I do not feel qualified to weigh in on that particular debate.
Well,
I will say it.
And I will say it.
But then I find, especially because the whole national hero argument is raging back home in St. Kitts and Nevis as well. And I find, especially in the Caribbean, we tend to think of national heroes. We want them to be saints. And they cannot be. I think we have to take a totally different approach to who we have as national heroes and stop thinking of them as saints.
Hello. After Rihanna was named Barbados National Hero, that was a whole set of bacchanal. Yeah, we want people, I don't know whoever set up the definition of what a national hero is, but it might be something that we need to look into and reformulate.
Could I argue that perhaps we could controversially have no national heroes?
No, but I think people should be recognized for their contributions. And I agree with Paula that I was surprised actually to read at the end of the book that Sheikh Keen was not a national hero, because that my understanding going in was, since it's the St. Vincent's History Month and we would be talking about national heroes, that he was a national hero. And so I was really surprised to read that he was not officially a national hero. And I'm not Vincentian, but if anyone wants my opinion, I think he definitely qualifies because when I mean, when you think about what he did in Europe for jazz music, I mean, that is just such an amazing contribution to the world. I mean, isn't that kind of what you want from your national heroes, that they do something that significantly changes something in the world for the better, obviously?
And he was an extraordinary poet.
Yes.
I'm inviting Vincent
And he
to
wrote,
not read his poetry, please
and he
do.
wrote in nation language
He wrote in
as
the
well,
yes,
But-
you know?
but
So,
he also wrote in Metropolitan English. The man
also,
was extraordinary.
mm,
But the thing is, one country that has many national heroes in the Caribbean is Barbados, for example. And Camo Brathwaite is not a national hero of Barbados. I don't know if maybe they offered it to him and he said no, but I'm just putting out there that he is not a national hero of Barbados. So I think that should give us, some thought as to how maybe Caribbean people think that maybe poetry is not great. I don't know.
Well,
One
this,
thing, when I said we shouldn't have national heroes, or we could consider not having national heroes, I was thinking more like we can reward people for their services and have our own, I hate to say it, UK version of, but the honor system, right? Where you recognize people and they have special titles, etc., without them being a national hero. Because I think national hero is it's a very fraught concept. We're never all going to agree on who should be a national hero and what is. Although, Paula, I did like your definition. I would vote for your version of a if I was going to choose national heroes. But I also think there has to be other ways of saying we produce greatness, other than a couple of people.
No, we can have national
Not
awards.
everybody can be national heroes, right?
I don't think it's an either or. We can have national awards and national heroes. It's not an either or. Because Bob, for example, has a national award in Jamaica. I think he's OJ. Is he Order of Jamaica? I can't remember what his award is, but I think he should be a hero.
yeah, well, this whole conversation and reading the book and discussing the book, I mean, hopefully this will forward people's thinking, scholarly thinking, and thinking on a more popular level about Sheikh King. We gotta read. I mean, Sheikh King deserves scholarly attention. His music deserves to be listened to and critiqued. His poetry should be read and critiqued. I mean, when I, again, as I mentioned, I never heard of him, but I did. I go to Spotify and I look him up. He's there, but I see it's like 387 monthly listeners. 387. Spotify is global. 387 listeners, and the brother could play that flugelhorn. Oh my goodness! I played some of his music in class yesterday. Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Oh my goodness, that I felt that in my marrow. I said, this brother knew something. So hopefully, this discussion going wide in the region, maybe some young person, some young scholar, or somebody in school want to do a project on Sheikh King.
Tony, you're muted.
Eric, sorry about the mute. I'm so happy that you feel so passionate about Sheikh. I mean, it warms my heart because you are not a Vincentian, and you read his story and you listened to his music and you appreciate the greatness of the man. And I agree with Paula. I think heroes need to be flawed. I wouldn't say should they be flawed. I think they need to be flawed because we must be able to understand the human side of who we are putting up on a pedestal and their frailties and their challenges and but the greatness overshadows all of that, and that is the final point. The point is the net effect is the man or the woman is greater than their weaknesses, and if you fit that category, then you certainly can be a national hero in my book, you know.
And as Tony mentions that the man or woman is greater than their weaknesses, we're going to have a reading of Credential performed by Sheikh Keen himself.
6-year-old, and my father gave me a trumpet, and he showed me how to blow it, how to polish it, how to respect it. And he said, exercise your potential, hold on to this. But the neighbor them say, boy, where your manners, where your wool tie, where your hymn book and your car card. You mean your father didn't give you that? So I tried my credential. I take it out and I polish it. And they like it. And I say, my father didn't give me that, but he give me this. 18-year-old, and my girlfriend vexed with me trumpet. She said, boy, where your money, where your hard pants, where your whiskey and your shot jack and your Fiat? That is essential. Otherwise you're going to miss tit for tat. So I roll out me credential, we repolish it, then I blow it, and she like it. And I say, my father didn't give me that, but he give me this. 35-year-old, and I hit the mother country. And I show them all the manners and the certificates. But they trouble me. They say, boy, where your history, where your culture, where your father, where your money and your hot shirt and your felt hat. I say, no profit. No potential in this. So I take out my essential and I polish it. And they respect it. And so they respect it, so I blow it. And I say, it's my father will give me that, and will give me this. 40-year-old, and I touch that down for the country. And I like it, and I cool it, and I bring back all my father trumpet, give them. But the sweet fool them say, boy, what you come back for? With your big cap, with your wool hat, with your sharp soul, and your whiskey, and your cantankerousness. All we culture, all we potential is definitely non-residential. All this trumpet is a famous load of piss. Hold on to this. So I heist up my trumpet. Same one when my father show how to blow, how to polish, how to respect. And I say, all you bastards, all I can just fear off.
We've had quite a wide-ranging discussion on Sheikh Keen, politics, the Windrush generation. We cover everything at Page Turners Plus. And now we're just going to take final thoughts on the book, thoughts on Sheikh Keen from everybody. And I'll just go clockwise. Kesua?
I said earlier that we don't lack stories, great people, or events that are worth studying. We lack scholars and particularly historians. And I'd like to draw everyone's attention to the fact that this book actually started out as a conference paper. That's how this journey began. And so I think it's really about taking ourselves more seriously and being willing to study all of the stories that we have to tell and to share them with the world. That's what Philip Nanton's done, and how much better are we all for it?
Francine?
Yeah. One of the things I wanted to bring up is that I started looking for his work online, and a lot of it is out of print. So I want to officially launch a petition that we somehow get his works published, because I think that it should be part of our CXC curriculum, for one thing. Another thing is, I really appreciated reading the book, learning about him, reading his story. I've been listening to some of his music since yesterday to get a feel for it. And actually, on a personal note, my brother-in-law is a classically trained jazz trumpeter. So I am definitely going to be talking to him about Sheikh Keen and passing the book on to him, because he loves learning about that kind of stuff. Really just a great story that I think all Caribbean people should be aware of.
Paula?
Well, I am so glad that I twisted your arms into reading this book, because you all fought me. You fought me on this. But this, I think Philip did an excellent job. He treated this subject matter very, very well. I did think he could have filled in some historical gaps for us, but certainly the treatment, the literary criticism was just absolutely brilliant. And I think it's a small biography. It's an easy read. I really want to encourage everybody to read this biography. It's really good. You can get it on Amazon. Please read it.
Eric?
Yeah, my final thoughts could have run on two levels. Number one, the production of the book for me was okay. I would have loved to have more context. I agree with Paula that the chapter on the poetry, spot on. Loved it, rich. But here's the thing that I take away. Here's the second level. Here's the thing I take away from the text. Sheikh Keen is larger than the production of Riff, the book. And hopefully the book and our discussion will advance scholarship on Sheikh Keen and also St. Vincent during the time, his upbringing, his return, and also to delve more into the musical scene of the Windrush generation. Those are my two aspirations, or three aspirations.
Tony?
Yeah, I think Philip Nanton did a very good job in capturing Sheikh's story. Sheikh, the riff, that's what he says. It's the Sheikhian story. I think he did a very good job. The historical context, unlike the views that some of you expressed, I didn't really feel that that there was such a big gap, and maybe because I subconsciously filled it in myself. So I maybe in a reread I would identify with what you're saying. His Phillips, capturing the various stages of Sheikh's life resonated with me because I knew Sheikh personally. And I have a confession to make. I actually ended up with one of Sheikhin's fugal horns on loan from the man himself. Sheikh started to teach me to play the fugal horn, and he left one of those treasured things in my house. That is the kind of guy that Sheikh was. As Eric says, a larger than life character. If you actually knew him, I think the man stood over 6 feet tall. He's a giant. And I am glad that Page Turners today decided to review the book, which is about the life of a Vincentian giant.
And I think I fully agree with everyone's comments. One challenge that I do put out to the Vincentians in the group is to go to the public library in St. Vincent in Kingstown and see if you could find copies of these books that are out of print from Sheikh Keen. I really would love to get my hands on on them. If his family members are listening, I don't know if you could reach out to a publisher. If you have copies of them, try to get it published. I think this is, if you publish 1,000, I'll buy 100. but the thing is, I really love the work. I really love the book. If you see my Amazon review on this particular book as well, I call it a book for a lonely soul. And I related so much to Sheikh Keen and Sheikh Keen's life, the beard and everything, and you don't understand. But once again, we have to thank our listeners for tuning into Page Turners Plus. It was a lovely discussion that we had today. And before we finish, I want to thank Dexter Rose and Jazz Tropical for making the audio of Credential available to us. And the next time that you're going to see Page Turners Plus, we'll be reviewing Sherry Jones, How the One-Armed Sister Sweeps Her House. Thank you very much for tuning in, and do have a lovely day.